Picture this: a respected Houston pastor stands before his congregation every Sunday, preaching about love, family, and moral values. But on May 18, 2010, this same man of God orchestrated the cold-blooded murder of his own wife using the most shocking accomplice imaginable, his own son. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about family loyalty, religious authority, and how far someone will go to protect their reputation. Today's case takes us to Houston, Texas, where a pastor's web of lies and betrayal would ultimately destroy 3 lives and shock an entire community. Tracy Burleson seemed to have it all. At 45 years old, he was the respected pastor of First New Mount Calvary Baptist Church in Houston. He lived in a comfortable home with his wife Paulette, who worked as a devoted church member and supportive pastor's wife. Tracy had built a reputation as a caring spiritual leader, someone the community trusted with their deepest secrets and most vulnerable moments. But like so many stories we cover on this channel, the perfect facade was hiding something much darker. Tracy had been living a double life for years, and when that secret threatened to surface, he would make a decision that would destroy everything he claimed to stand for. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Have you ever known someone who seemed perfect on the outside but was hiding major secrets? Let me know in the comments below. Your stories always help us understand these complex cases better. To understand what happened on that fatal May evening, we need to go back and examine the players in this twisted drama. Our story begins with Tracy Burleson's affair with Tyonne Palmer, a 32-year-old nurse practitioner who worked at a local medical facility. Palmer was educated, successful, and by all accounts, an attractive woman who had caught Tracy's attention. What started as casual conversations after church services eventually developed into something much more serious. Tracy would later tell investigators that he fell deeply in love with Palmer, describing feelings he claimed he'd never experienced before. But here's where this case takes its first shocking turn. Tracy wasn't the only Burleson man who had fallen for Tyonne Palmer. His son, William Fuller, was also romantically involved with the same woman. Let that sink in for a moment. A father and son, both pursuing the same woman, both believing they had exclusive relationships with her. William Fuller was 25 years old and struggling with sickle cell anemia, a painful genetic condition that had left him financially dependent on his father and stepmother. Fuller lived with Tracy and Paulette, working odd jobs when his health permitted but largely relying on his family for support. The love triangle between Tracy, William, and Tyonne created a powder keg of jealousy, manipulation, and desperation. Tracy was risking his marriage, his pastoral position, and his reputation. William was competing with his own father for the affections of a woman who seemed to be playing both men against each other. And Paulette? She was completely unaware that her husband and stepson were both involved with the same woman, both making promises they couldn't keep, both spiraling toward a decision that would cost her everything. What do you think Tyonne Palmer's role was in all this? Was she an innocent victim caught between 2 men, or was she deliberately manipulating the situation? Drop your theories in the comments. I'm curious to hear your take on this complex dynamic. By early 2010, Tracy Burleson found himself in an impossible situation. His affair with Tyonne Palmer had become more than just a secret relationship. It had become an obsession. He wanted to be with her permanently, but there was one major obstacle: his wife Paulette. Divorce wasn't an option Tracy was willing to consider. As a pastor, a divorce would likely end his career and destroy his reputation in the religious community. He'd lose his position at the church, his standing in the community, and probably his comfortable lifestyle. The scandal would follow him everywhere. But Tracy had another problem that made his situation even more desperate. His son William was also deeply involved with Tyonne, and the competition between father and son was becoming more intense. Both men were making promises to Palmer about their future together, and both were growing increasingly desperate to eliminate the competition. This is where Tracy made a calculation that reveals the depths of his moral corruption. Rather than ending the affair or coming clean about his double life, he decided that murder was his best option. And he knew exactly who he could manipulate into helping him. William Fuller's sickle cell anemia had left him not just physically vulnerable, but financially desperate. He was dependent on his father for housing, money, and medical care. When Tracy approached his son with a proposition, He knew exactly which buttons to push. The plan was as simple as it was horrifying. Tracy would arrange for William to kill Paulette, making it look like a robbery gone wrong. In exchange, William would receive $3,000 from Paulette's life insurance policy, money that would help him get back on his feet and pursue his relationship with Tyonne. But here's the twisted part that investigators would later uncover. Tracy never intended for William to get the girl. He was using his son's desperation and illness against him, manipulating him into committing murder so that Tracy could eliminate both his wife and his competition for Tyonne's affections. Think about the psychology here for a moment. Tracy was willing to turn his own son into a murderer, knowing that William would likely be caught and face life in prison. He was essentially trading his son's freedom for his own selfish desires. What kind of father does that? I want to pause here and ask you something. We've all heard about parents who would do anything to protect their children. But what about parents who would sacrifice their children to protect themselves? How do you even begin to understand that mindset? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. May 18, 2010, started like any other day for Paulette Burleson. She had no idea that her husband and stepson had been planning her death for weeks. She had no idea that the two men she trusted most in the world had decided her life was worth less than their secret obsessions. Tracy's plan required a solid alibi, so he made sure to be seen in public at the time of the murder. He went to a local convenience store, making a point to interact with the clerk and establish his presence away from home. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was premeditated murder with careful planning. Meanwhile, William Fuller was preparing himself for the unthinkable. Despite his father's promises and manipulations, Fuller later told investigators that he struggled with the decision right up until the moment he pulled the trigger. But his dependence on Tracy and his desperate desire to please both his father and Tyonne Palmer ultimately won out over his conscience. When Paulette arrived home that evening, she probably felt safe pulling into her own driveway. This was her sanctuary, her home, the place where she should have been protected by the people who claimed to love her. Instead, she was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. William Fuller was waiting for her, armed with a gun that Tracy had helped him obtain. As Paulette got out of her car, Fuller approached her. What happened next would be described by investigators as an execution-style killing. There was no struggle, no attempt at robbery, just a single gunshot that ended Paulette's life instantly. The scene was meant to look like a random robbery, but Fuller's inexperience as a killer immediately created problems. He panicked after the shooting, failing to take anything that would support the robbery narrative. He left behind evidence that would later connect him to the crime, including DNA and fingerprints that couldn't be explained away. But the most damning evidence was something Tracy and William never considered. Their own technology would betray them. Cell phone records would later show that despite Tracy's claim of being at a convenience store during the murder, his phone was actually pinging off cell towers near his home at the exact time of Paulette's death. Even more damaging, the records showed that Tracy and William's phones were in the same location during the murder, completely contradicting their alibi. Here's something that really gets to me about this case. Paulette trusted these men completely. She never suspected that her husband was having an affair, let alone that he was planning to have her killed. She welcomed William into her home, supported him through his illness, and treated him like her own son. And this is how they repaid her kindness. What do you think goes through someone's mind in those final moments? Do you think Paulette realized what was happening? Or did she die still believing her family loved her? It's a heartbreaking thought that stays with me every time I research cases like this. When police arrived at the Burleson home on May 18th, they initially treated Paulette's death as a robbery gone wrong. The scene appeared to support that theory. A woman shot in her own driveway, her purse nearby, no obvious signs of personal conflict. But experienced investigators know that most murders aren't random. They know that when someone is killed, the answer usually lies within their closest relationships. And when they started looking at Tracy and William's stories, things didn't add up. Tracy's grief seemed genuine to some observers, but investigators noticed inconsistencies in his timeline. He claimed to have been at a convenience store when his wife was killed, but when police checked, they discovered that store was actually closed at the time he claimed to have been there. It was the first crack in his carefully constructed alibi. William Fuller's behavior also raised red flags. He seemed nervous and agitated when questioned, and his story about where he was during the murder kept changing. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source, an anonymous phone call. Someone called the police tip line and suggested they take a closer look at the Burleson family dynamics. The caller seemed to know details about the case that hadn't been released to the public, and they specifically mentioned the possibility of a family conspiracy. Based on this tip, investigators decided to dig deeper into the family's background. What they discovered was the secret affair, the love triangle, and the financial motive that had driven Tracy to plan his wife's murder. But the real breakthrough came when investigators obtained a wiretap warrant for William Fuller's phone. They suspected he might be the weak link in the conspiracy, and they were right. Fuller, struggling with guilt over what he'd done, made several phone calls where he essentially confessed to the murder. In one recorded conversation, Fuller told a friend that he had killed his stepmother for money and that his father had put him up to it. He described feeling sick about what he'd done, but said he'd been promised that everything would work out once they got the insurance money. These recordings gave investigators exactly what they needed to make arrests. But before they could close the case, they had to piece together the full scope of the conspiracy and understand Tyonne Palmer's role in the events. What strikes me most about this phase of the investigation is how quickly the truth came out once investigators started looking in the right direction. Tracy thought he had planned the perfect crime, but he made fundamental mistakes that any experienced investigator would catch. Do you think he was overconfident, or was he just desperate enough to take risks he shouldn't have taken? Once investigators had William Fuller's confession on tape, the case against Tracy Burleson and Tyonne Palmer began to solidify quickly. Digital forensics revealed the extent of the conspiracy and the manipulations that had led to Paulette's death. Palmer's involvement became clear when investigators found love letters and romantic communications between her and Tracy. These weren't just casual messages. They were detailed discussions about their future together, their frustrations with. Even more damaging were communications between Palmer and William Fuller. Investigators discovered that Palmer had been playing both men against each other, making promises to both while encouraging their competition. She knew about the murder plot and had done nothing to stop it or warn Paulette. The digital evidence painted a picture of a calculated conspiracy. Cell phone records showed that all three conspirators had been in contact throughout the day of the murder, coordinating their activities and maintaining their alibis. Tracy's phone data proved he was lying about his whereabouts, while Palmer's communications showed she was actively encouraging both men in their pursuit of her. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence came from Tracy's own words. In conversations with Palmer, he talked about Paulette as if she were merely an obstacle to be removed, not a human being with her own right to life. He showed no remorse for what he was planning, only excitement about his future with Palmer. When confronted with this evidence, William Fuller broke down and agreed to cooperate with investigators. He provided detailed testimony about how his father had manipulated him into committing the murder, playing on his illness, his financial desperation, and his desire to please both Tracy and Palmer. Fuller's testimony revealed the full extent of Tracy's manipulation. Tracy had promised his son that killing Paulette would solve all their problems. William would get money from the insurance policy, Tracy would be free to marry Palmer, and everyone would be happy. Of course, Tracy never intended to share Palmer with his son, but he used that promise to convince William to pull the trigger. The betrayal within this family is almost impossible to comprehend. Tracy didn't just murder his wife, he destroyed his son's life in the process. He turned William into a killer, knowing that his son would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. And he did it all for a woman who was manipulating both of them. What do you think about William Fuller's role in this case? He was clearly manipulated by his father and taken advantage of because of his illness and financial dependence. But he still made the choice to pull the trigger. How do you balance understanding his vulnerability with holding him accountable for his actions? The trials of Tracy Burleson, William Fuller, and Tyonne Palmer revealed the full scope of their conspiracy and the devastating impact of their actions on the Houston community. Tracy Burleson was charged with capital murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecution presented a compelling case based on digital evidence, witness testimony, and the recorded confessions of his co-conspirators. Tracy's defense team tried to argue that he was a grieving widower who had been wrongfully accused, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. The most powerful moment in Tracy's trial came when William Fuller testified against his father. Fuller, who had already accepted a plea deal, described in detail how Tracy had manipulated him into committing murder. He talked about the promises his father had made, the financial pressure he was under, and the way Tracy had used his illness against him. Fuller's testimony was devastating because it showed the jury exactly how Tracy had betrayed his most fundamental duty as a father. Instead of protecting his son, Tracy had turned him into a weapon to eliminate his wife. The jury saw Tracy not just as a murderer, but as a father who had sacrificed his child's future for his own selfish desires. Tracy Burleson was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge noted that Tracy had shown no remorse for his actions and had continued to manipulate people even during his trial. William Fuller received a sentence of 20 years in prison as part of his plea agreement. While some felt this was too lenient given that he was the one who actually pulled the trigger, others argued that his cooperation with investigators and his status as a victim of his father's manipulation justified the reduced sentence. Tyonne Palmer was charged with conspiracy to commit murder and tampering with evidence. The prosecution argued that while she didn't directly participate in the murder, her manipulation of both Tracy and William had been a crucial factor in driving them to violence. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison. The impact on the Houston religious community was profound. First New Mount Calvary Baptist Church struggled to recover from the scandal, with many members questioning how they could have been so wrong about their spiritual leader. The case sparked conversations about accountability in religious leadership and the danger of placing too much trust in charismatic figures. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this case is what happened to the family that survived. Paulette Burleson's extended family lost not just a beloved wife and mother, but also had to grapple with the fact that her murder had been orchestrated by the people she trusted most. As I wrap up this case, I want to ask you something that's been on my mind throughout this investigation. We often talk about crimes of passion, where someone acts impulsively in a moment of rage or desperation. But this was different. This was a calculated decision to commit murder, made by someone who had devoted his life to preaching about love and morality. What do you think drives someone to that level of hypocrisy? How does a person who stands in front of a congregation every Sunday and talks about the sanctity of life and marriage convince himself that murder is acceptable? Is it pure selfishness, or is there something deeper at work? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case and others like it. Have you ever encountered someone who seemed to live a completely different life behind closed doors? How do we protect ourselves and our communities from people who are willing to manipulate and harm others to get what they want? This case reminds us that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it wears a collar and stands behind a pulpit. Sometimes it lives in our own homes and claims to love us. The challenge is learning to recognize the warning signs and trust our instincts when something doesn't feel right. If this case affected you the way it affected me, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue investigating these important stories and hopefully prevent similar tragedies from happening to other families. Thank you for watching.